$10,000. The old man's voice trembled as he raised his numbered paddle, the wedding ring in the display case gleaming under crystal lights. Around him, designer suits and evening gowns rustled with quiet laughter. Someone whispered, "How adorable," in a tone that made it anything but. The elderly gentleman stood resolute in his worn brown jacket, surrounded by the opulence of Christie's most exclusive Manhattan showroom. He'd spent 6 months saving for this moment, for the chance to reclaim the ring that had graced his Sarah's finger for 52 years. The young tech billionaire in the front row didn't even turn around as he lazily lifted his paddle. 20,000. He was playing with his phone, barely glancing at the vintage 1940s diamond ring that meant everything to the old man. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, his practiced voice filling the tension. 20,000? Do I hear 25? In the third row, a figure in a dark suit shifted slightly, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. Jack Nicholson had attended countless auctions, but something about this one felt different. The young tech billionaire in the front row didn't even turn around as he lazily lifted his paddle. 20,000. He was playing with his phone, barely glancing at the vintage 1940s diamond ring that meant everything to the old man. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, his practiced voice filling the tension. 20,000, do I hear 25? In the third row, a figure in a dark suit shifted slightly, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. Jack Nicholson had attended countless auctions, but something about this one felt different. The ring had never been meant for auction. Robert Thompson had discovered its absence during his weekly visit to Sarah's grave. When he'd opened the small velvet box he always carried to show her how well he'd kept it. The cleaning service had found it in their vacuum's catch bag, mistaking it for costume jewelry among the dust. By then, it had already been logged into Christie's spring catalog, Lot 247, vintage 1940s, diamond solitaire, unique setting. Sarah had worn it through 52 years of marriage, through raising 3 children, through cancer treatments, and recovery. When arthritis had gnarled her fingers, she'd worn it on a chain around her neck. Even in her final days, she'd held on to it, her thumb worrying the worn gold band that Robert had saved 3 months' salary to buy in 1946. They'd laughed then about how extravagant it was for a young mechanic to spend so much on a ring. Now, surrounded by people who spent more on lunch than he had on that ring, Robert felt every one of his 87 years weighing on his shoulders. The tech billionaire, barely older than his grandchildren, raised his paddle again. 30,000. A ripple of murmurs spread through the auction room as Robert's hand trembled on his paddle. The tech billionaire, Marcus Chen of Silicon Valley's latest unicorn startup, turned in his seat with an expression of manufactured concern. "Hey, old-timer, no hard feelings, right?" "I just really like vintage stuff." His friends in the front row snickered, their amusement carrying across the hushed room. "I'm thinking of starting a collection." The auctioneer's gavel remained poised, his voice professionally neutral. $30,000, do I hear 35? The crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across the display case, making the modest diamond seem to dance with the same joy it had held when Robert first placed it on Sarah's finger. He could still hear her gasp of delight, see the tears in her eyes as she'd whispered, "It's too much, Bobby." In the third row, Jack Nicholson's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He'd witnessed plenty of Hollywood power plays, but this casual cruelty masked as philanthropy struck a deeper chord. His own mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band, still sat in its honored place on his desk at home. Robert's arthritic fingers clutched the small velvet box he'd brought, identical to the one in the display case. Inside lay the receipt from Gelman's Jewelry, dated June 15, 1946, the paper thin and yellow with age. He'd thought it would be enough to prove the ring was his, but Christie's had politely explained that without official documentation of ownership, the sale would proceed as scheduled. Marcus Chen's friends were passing around their phones now, taking discreet photos of the old man's distress. One whispered loudly enough to carry, "This is going viral for sure. #auction fails." The cultural gap between their worlds seemed as vast as the financial one. To them, this was just content for their social media feeds, another fleeting moment of entertainment. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $30,000 going once. Robert closed his eyes, Sarah's voice echoing in his memory. "Promise me you'll keep it in the family, Bobby." The first tear rolled down his weathered cheek. In the third row, Jack Nicholson slowly removed his tinted glasses, folding them deliberately as his eyes fixed on Marcus Chen's smirking profile. Going twice. The auctioneer's voice hung in the air as Jack Nicholson rose from his seat, the movement drawing every eye in the room. He took his time, adjusting his suit jacket with the unhurried confidence that had made him a Hollywood legend. The silence deepened as he turned, not toward the auctioneer, but toward Marcus Chen. "You know what I love about auctions, kid." His voice carried that familiar, gravelly tone that had delivered some of cinema's most memorable lines. "They show us exactly who people are." He moved deliberately down his row, each step measured, not just what they can buy, but who they are inside. Marcus Chen's smirk faltered slightly as Jack approached, the young billionaire's friends lowering their phones one by one. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the climate control system maintaining the perfect temperature for the precious items on display. "I've been watching you," Jack continued, stopping at the end of Chen's row, "playing with your phone, treating this like some game." He gestured toward Robert, who stood transfixed, the yellowed receipt still clutched in his trembling hands. "But this isn't a game, that ring? It's got more stories, more love, more life in it than anything else in this room, including you." The auctioneer's gavel remained frozen in midair as Jack reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his own paddle. The number 88 flashed under the crystal lights as he raised it. $50,000. Marcus Chen's fingers tightened around his paddle, his earlier amusement hardening into something darker. The young billionaire hadn't built his empire by backing down from challenges. $75,000, he snapped, shooting a defiant glare at Nicholson. His friends had stopped filming, sensing the shift from entertainment to genuine confrontation. 100,000. Jack's response came instantly, his voice carrying decades of screen presence. He turned to address the room at large, his legendary eyebrows drawing together. "You know, I've played a lot of characters in my time, heroes, villains, everything in between, but the best roles, the ones that really matter, they're always about what someone stands for." Robert Thompson swayed slightly, overwhelmed by the numbers being thrown around. His grandson's yearly salary couldn't match what was being bid for Sarah's ring. A young woman in the back row quietly offered him her chair, which he took with trembling gratitude. 200,000. Marcus's voice cracked slightly, his carefully cultivated image of casual indifference slipping. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. His latest app had made him a fortune, but it hadn't prepared him for a face-off with Jack Nicholson. "You still don't get it, do you?" Jack shook his head, his voice taking on the quiet intensity that had earned him 3 Academy Awards. "This isn't about money. This was never about money." He raised his paddle again, his eyes locked on Chen. $500,000. The collective gasp seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. Marcus Chen stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. $1 million! His voice echoed through the auction room, carrying equal parts desperation and defiance. The crowd's murmuring rose to an audible buzz. No one had ever paid $1 million for a simple vintage engagement ring at Christie's. "Son," Jack's voice cut through the chaos with the quiet authority that had commanded cinema screens for decades. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at that ring. I see a young mechanic in 1946 counting every penny he earned. I see a love story that lasted 52 years. I see a widow keeping her promise to her Bobby until her last breath." He turned to Robert Thompson, who sat clutching the yellowed receipt, tears flowing freely now. The room fell silent as Jack continued, each word weighted with purpose. "But when you look at that ring, you know what you see? Numbers on a screen. Another asset to add to your portfolio. Another story for your social media." His eyes narrowed behind his signature eyebrows. "And that's why you'll never understand its real value." Marcus Chen's hand trembled as he raised his paddle one final time. $2 million! His voice cracked, but his eyes blazed with the determination of someone unused to losing. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, the entire room holding its breath. Jack Nicholson smiled then, not his famous movie smile, but something gentler, sadder, wiser. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Marcus Chen's face drain of color. From his pocket, Jack withdrew a small, worn photograph. The edges were creased, the colors faded to sepia tones, but the image was clear enough for the front row to see. A young woman in a 1940s nurse's uniform, smiling at the camera, her left hand raised to show off a modest diamond ring, the same ring that sat in the display case. "Sarah Thompson," Jack's voice filled the hushed room. "County General Hospital, 1946, the nurse who took care of my mother when no one else would. When we couldn't afford proper medical care, she worked extra shifts to ensure Mom got the treatment she needed." He turned to Robert, whose eyes had widened in recognition. "I was just a kid then, but I never forgot her kindness. Never forgot how that ring would catch the light when she changed Mom's bandages." The photograph trembled slightly in Jack's hand as he continued. "She wouldn't accept any payment from us. Said it was her duty, her calling. But she did show me her new engagement ring one day. Told me how her Bobby had saved for months to buy it, how she'd never seen anything so beautiful." Marcus Chen sank slowly back into his chair, his paddle lowering as the true weight of the moment settled over him. The story had already begun, spreading through the room in whispered conversations, phones forgotten in hands that now covered mouths in astonishment. The auctioneer stood frozen, gavel suspended, as Hollywood's most iconic eyebrows turned back to the young billionaire. "You see, Mr. Chen," Jack continued, his voice carrying that quiet intensity that had hushed movie theaters for decades. "Some things in this world have a value you can't measure in dollars. This ring?" He gestured to the display case. "It's not just platinum and diamond. It's 52 years of morning coffees. It's holding hands through 3 children's births. It's weathering cancer treatments and celebrating remissions." Robert Thompson stood shakily, supported by the young woman who had offered him her chair. His voice quavered, but carried clearly. "Sarah never took it off. Not once in 52 years, even in the hospital at the end." He trailed off, overcome. Jack crossed to Robert's side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "I've earned more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes," he addressed the room, though his eyes remained on Marcus Chen. "Won awards, gained fame, lived what most would call a dream life. But you know what I've learned? The most valuable things in this world are the ones that remind us of our humanity." The silence in the auction room had taken on a different quality now, no longer tense with confrontation, but heavy with shared emotion. Phones had disappeared into pockets and purses, their owners suddenly conscious of having tried to turn a sacred moment into viral content. Marcus Chen sat very still, his face flushed with a shame he'd never experienced in all his years of aggressive business dealings. The young billionaire looked down at his paddle, then at the simple wedding ring that had sparked this extraordinary scene. Marcus Chen slowly rose from his chair, his usual confident demeanor stripped away. The young billionaire's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the auction room, everyone heard him clearly. "I withdraw my bid." He turned to face Robert Thompson directly. "Sir, I'm sorry. I treated this like a game, but it's not. It's your life, your love story." The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly uncertain about this unprecedented situation. "Mr. Chen, once a bid is placed—" "I'll cover any contractual obligations," Jack interrupted smoothly, reaching into his jacket. "But this ring?" He lifted his paddle one final time. $500,000, with the condition that it be returned to its rightful owner. Robert's hands trembled as he opened the velvet box containing Sarah's receipt. "But I can't possibly—" "Consider it 52 years of accumulated interest on a debt I could never repay," Jack said softly, the gravelly warmth in his voice reminiscent of his most touching roles. "Your Sarah gave my mother hope when we had none. Some debts can only be paid forward." The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack that seemed to release the room's collective held breath. As the ring was carefully removed from its display case, Jack turned to Marcus Chen. "Remember this moment, kid. In 30 years, it won't be your bank balance that matters. It'll be the stories you're part of, and whether you played the hero or the villain." Marcus nodded slowly, a change in his eyes suggesting that, for the first time in his meteoric rise to wealth, he was truly seeing the world through different eyes. The Christie's staff brought out champagne, transforming the auction into an impromptu celebration. As Robert Thompson slipped the ring back into its familiar velvet box, his weathered hands steadier now, the room buzzed with quiet conversations and discreet wiping of eyes. This wasn't just the return of a piece of jewelry, it was the restoration of a legacy. Jack Nicholson shared quiet words with Robert, their heads bent together as the older man showed him a small photo album he'd brought, pages filled with snapshots of Sarah throughout their years together. The same gentle smile graced every image, the ring catching light in photographs spanning half a century. Marcus Chen stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold. His phone remained untouched in his pocket, social media forgotten. One of his friends approached with a glass of champagne, but stopped short at the expression on the young billionaire's face. It was the look of someone seeing their own reflection clearly for the first time and not entirely liking what they saw. The story spread through social media channels in a way entirely different from what Marcus Chen's friends had initially intended. Instead of mockery, the posts carried messages of reflection and revelation. The video clips showed not an old man's humiliation, but a young billionaire's transformation and a Hollywood legend's wisdom. Christie's auction house found itself hosting an impromptu gathering, as nobody seemed willing to leave. The remaining lots were postponed by mutual agreement. Some moments deserved their space to breathe. In one corner, Robert shared stories about Sarah with an increasingly large audience, each tale centered around small acts of kindness that had rippled through decades. Marcus Chen approached Jack Nicholson with unusual hesitation. "Mr. Nicholson," he began, his usual confidence replaced by genuine humility, "would you consider joining me for coffee? I'd like to learn more about your mother, about Sarah Thompson, about seeing value in things I've been too busy counting dollars to notice." Jack's legendary eyebrows rose slightly as he studied the young man's face, seeing something there worth investing in, not with money, but with time. A week later, Christie's released an unprecedented statement. Marcus Chen had established a new foundation dedicated to preserving family heirlooms and returning them to their rightful owners. The young billionaire's tech expertise would help connect lost treasures with their families, turning his fortune toward healing rather than acquisition. Robert Thompson visited Sarah's grave that Sunday, as he had every week for the past 2 years. The ring rested in its familiar velvet box, as he shared the story of its return. A fresh bouquet of flowers lay nearby, Jack Nicholson's quiet tribute to the nurse who had cared for his mother so many years ago. In Hollywood, on Jack's desk, a new photo stood beside his mother's simple gold band. It showed 3 generations: Robert Thompson, Jack Nicholson, and Marcus Chen, taken at the first meeting of the Foundation's board. The ring gleamed on Robert's finger as he gestured, telling another of Sarah's stories. In that captured moment, the true value of an heirloom was clear, not in its price, but in its power to connect hearts across time, teaching each generation what really matters: